Peter, thank you so much for your willingness to join us today and be not only our first person, but our first person of 2018. So welcome. You've got a lot to share with us, so we're gonna jump right in if you don't mind. World War II began when Germany and Russia invaded Poland in September 1939. Before you tell us about what happened to you and your family during the war and the Holocaust, tell us a little bit about your family before the war began.
A little bit of background. Jews have been living in Hungary the last 2,000 years, and unfortunately, anti-Semitism has a history of 2,000 years in Hungary also. I came from Jewish parents. On my mother's side, she grew up in a very Orthodox, observant Jewish family. On my father's side, it's a little bit more liberal. It's about the same as conservative Judaism here in Hungary. And my great-grandparent, one of my great-grandfathers was a rabbi in a small town which is part of Slovakia. Today, my grandfather studied to be a rabbi, but he had 9 children, and he had to have a civilian job, obviously. My parents, both of them, were born in 1907, and they met in Budapest in the early 30s. My father, after graduated from high school, he wanted to be a lawyer. Unfortunately, by that time in Hungary, anti-Semitic laws were in effect, and one of the first one, more than 10 years before the infamous Nuremberg laws, Hungarian laws restricted very strictly the number of students at higher education institutions. My father wanted to be a lawyer. He applied 3 times. He was rejected 3 times because he didn't meet the quota. He became an office manager in a publishing company. My mother, she was always very good with her hands, and women at that time didn't really look for higher education, so she went to a vocational school. She became a milliner, a female hat maker, which was very fashionable in the 20s and 30s. And so we had a relatively good middle-class life in Hungary.
Peter, you described your mother to me, though, as the black sheep of the family. Would you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I didn't know that this question would come up. As I said, she is from a very observant Orthodox family. However, she wasn't observing all the particular laws very strictly. One thing what happened the day before her wedding, she went to the hairdresser to make her hair pretty for next day. Next day, her father walked into the room, and he told her that it's time to go to the mikvah. Mikvah is a ritual bath Jewish women take time to time, and definitely before their weddings. So there she was with her new beautiful hairdo, and she had to go to the mikvah where she was completely immersed, and her hair needed some reparations. But fortunately, before the wedding started, she had enough time to
redo it.
And the wedding pictures are beautiful.
Peter, your father eventually joined your mother in the hat-making business. Why was that?
It was that because by the late 30s, the Holocaust history in Hungary, it's a little bit different from rest of Europe. Hungary has not been or have not been occupied by Nazi Germany until early 1944. However, the Hungarian government was a close ally of Nazi Germany. The Hungarian government enacted laws which were as strict, sometimes even stricter than the infamous Nuremberg laws.
Were these the numeral clauses?
The numerous clauses was the very first one in 1920, and later on there were 3 consecutive so-called Jewish laws in 1939, 40, and 41. First, Jews were kicked out from all government jobs. Their numbers were restricted in most major professions like lawyers and doctors. Jewish doctors could serve only Jewish patients. Jewish patients could go only to Jewish doctors. So my father lost his job because the anti-Jewish laws in Hungary, and he decided that private enterprises at that time weren't controlled very much so he wanted to learn how to make hats and go in business with my mother.
With your mom. Although World War II began in September 1939, as you were beginning to tell us, the full brunt of the war and the mass deportation of Jews in Hungary didn't occur until 1944. Nonetheless, as you were starting to tell us, conditions worsened for Jews in 1939 in Hungary and got increasingly worse for your family from then on, especially when your father was taken for forced labor. Tell us what you can about the circumstances for you and your family once the war began and about your father being conscripted into a labor battalion.
My mom got pregnant with me in June 1940, and in October 1940, my father was taken to the first labor battalions. These forced labor battalions in Hungary and the camps where my father stayed, at least at the beginning, they weren't like concentration camps. They were camps attached to military units. And that's where Jewish males between the age of 18 and 55 were taken. They were not given ammunition or rifles because they were not trusted. And they had to do all the dirty jobs for the military. And that's where my father was taken in northeastern Hungary. 1941 March, that's when I was born, and in June, you saw that picture earlier. That was not only the last picture, but it was the first picture also, which was made with the whole family, my mom,
the only one,
father,
the only
and
picture,
myself. Yeah. And he was released for a long weekend, and he had to go back, and that was the last time he saw me. I saw him, although I don't have a memory. And later on, his unit was moved from one place to another until Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union, and the Hungarians were close allies of the Nazis, and the Hungarian army not only occupied part of Yugoslavia, Romania, Slovakia, but also they went into the Soviet Union, and so went the people who were in the forced labor battalions. What happened next, we don't know. What you hear today, it's from my mom, who, interestingly enough, and that's part of the Holocaust history, not just in Hungary, but all over Europe, that people who survived, they didn't want to talk about their experience, not even within the family. So my mom opened only when I was in my late 40s, already lived in the United States. So what I could reconstruct of our family lives was partly from my mom's memories, partly because my mom started a diary when I was born. Her purpose was not to publish it one day. Her purpose was that when my father would come back, she would remember every details what happened to me. So she jotted down the first words I mispronounced, obviously, and all the silly things I did, how much I hated being washed every night. And so this notebook and two others is the history of my first couple of years growing up in Hungary. Also, she preserved postcards my father sent from the forced labor battalion. Once a week, they were allowed to send a postcard. They could not write down where they were. They could not write down the circumstances because it was censored by the military. But he wrote down how he felt, what his dreams were, what he hoped for. And if we had a little time, I would like to read one or two
from the postcards, right?
Paragraphs from my mom's diary, so you get the impression how people who lived through the Holocaust, how they felt. And this is from my mom's diary. She rode an emotional roller coaster. She went to the high of love, to the low of desperation, and then again up to the consolation. So this is what she wrote. You, that's addressed to my father, you have no idea how much I long to see you. The thought of seeing you and having you next to me drives me to insanity. Why the good Lord punishes me so much that the one I adore the most is separated from me for such a long time? From here she went to desperations. I cannot stand this horrible situation that I am heading to a nervous breakdown. I try to control myself and I try to believe that you are not in any trouble, you just haven't had the time for writing. That was after she didn't get a postcard for 1 or 2 weeks. From there, she went to consolation. One day you will show up at our door without any advance notice, and then I would not switch with anyone in the world, and I'll be the most happy person ever lived. This is the only thing that keeps me going. Unfortunately, my father never came back. Out of the 100,000 people who were taken in the forced labor battalions, 40,000 never returned. And those who survived, they were, many of them were taken captives by the Soviet Red Army, were taken to Siberia, and after the war, they were released. So this is how we learned about what happened in general in these forced labor battalions and how many people died during those circumstances.
Peter, you, as you were mentioning, reading your mother's diary, that she was writing to your father and being in the hopes that she would later share your early life. But the diaries also gave you told me, a glimpse of what life was like for her during that time without your father, because she had to support the family. What was she doing during that time with your father away?
Well, we continued to live in an apartment. My mom was making hats, making relatively good money, as long as food was not rationed, which later on the food was rationed. We could buy food, we had water, electricity. She even had time to go out to one of the famous coffee houses in Budapest with her friends. and she felt guilty about it, and she wrote about it in the diary that while my father was suffering in the forced labor camp, she had this luxury to have a cup of coffee with her friends. So, yeah, that's from the diary what I learned. Later on, the anti-Jewish laws got even more stricter and stricter. Jewish people had to give up all of their valuable objects, jewelry, pictures, fur coats. They had to take to the Hungarian National Bank. They get a receipt, but nobody ever got anything back after the war. And of course, out of the 800,000 Hungarian Jews who lived in Hungary before the war, only 200,000 survived. 3 out of 4 perished during the Holocaust.
Peter, as you were telling us about your father's postcards that he sent, at some point the postcards stopped. When did the postcards stop, and when did your mother learn about your father's death?
The date on the last postcard is December 2021, just before Christmas, I believe. And that time he was stationed in Transylvania, close to the Ukrainian border, or that time it was Soviet Union. Later on, his battalion was taken to Ukraine, and in April 1940, it was 43, my mom got a notification from the Hungarian Ministry of Defense, which oversaw the military units and the attached forced labor battalions, that my father disappeared in January 1943, and he was declared dead on February 15. Now, being declared dead could mean anything. It could mean that he was shot by a Soviet soldier. It could mean that he was frozen to death, because we know from the survivors that the winter of 1942-1943, winters usually in the Soviet Union are very harsh. Temperatures are in the minus 40s, 50s, snow is knee-high, and these people had to march in their mostly civilian clothes. Under those circumstances, they were weak because they didn't have enough food, they didn't have medical attention. Many people just couldn't march any longer. They sat down, and in a couple of minutes, they were frozen to death. Some of them were killed by the commanding officers. It was a kind of mercy killing, if you can say that. They didn't have to suffer the being frozen. They were instantly dead. Other people in the forced labor camp died because these people were used to defuse mines left behind the retreating Soviet army, and these people were doctors, lawyers, teachers, educated people, but they were not educated in how to defuse mines. So the way they defused the mine, the officers had them march through the mining fields. And as they marched through the mines, they stepped on a mine exploded, so did the person who stepped on it. So we don't know exactly what happened to my father. We do know that he disappeared during the war activities. That was the official explanation.
That was the spring of 1943, when she learned that he was dead. Yeah. And then your mother, and it was just your mother and you, and she continues to work and try to support you under those very difficult circumstances. And as hard as the conditions had been for Jews in Hungary, life became, of course, profoundly worse when the Nazis occupied Hungary in March 1944, about a year after she learned about your father's death. Why did things change so dramatically in 1944, and what did it mean for you, your mother, and other Jews in Hungary once the Germans came in?
Once the Germans came in, new anti-Jewish laws were put in the books, and one of them was that all Jewish person had to leave their apartment and to move into government-designated houses. These houses were marked with a yellow Star of David, so the people who had to wear a yellow Star of David on their clothes starting in April 1944. So we had to leave our apartment, but my mom, she was a very smart cookie, if I can say that, and she knew that it's not a smart idea to move to these designated houses, because once the Jews are gathered at one place, they can be moved to another place and another place. So instead of moving into these designated houses, we moved into the apartment of her childhood friend, who was brave enough to offer us a place because, according to the laws in place that time, those who hid Jewish people had the same punishment as the Jewish people who were hiding. Nevertheless, we lived in this apartment for 2 or 3 weeks when a good neighbor denounced us to the police. Next day, 2 policemen showed up, and they arrested my mom, and they took her away. They left me behind in an apartment, and the family I stayed with, actually, that was just a couple. They didn't have children at that time. I stayed with them.
And I'm going to interrupt you, Peter, if you don't mind. That, when the police came to arrest your mom, I believe that was one of your actual earliest memories, that you actually remember this.
Yes. Again, I was 4 years old when the Budapest ghetto was liberated, so at that time I was three and a half. But I very vividly remember when these 2 gendarmes showed up at our apartment because they had a fancy uniform with a tall hat. It's like the one, or close to the one President Lincoln had, and it had some cock feather attached to the hat, so it caught my fancy. And I remember that we were at the dining room table, we had breakfast. I was too small to reach the table, so I was sitting on 2 big books, probably phone books. And I remember, for me, my mom's arrest wasn't so dramatic because I didn't know what happened. I just saw that 2 persons came in fancy uniform. They went, my mom went with them, and the couple I stayed with, they assured me that my mom will come back in a couple of hours.
And in fact, your mom was arrested, taken to jail. What happened to her next?
That was part of her character, the chutzpah, if I can use that word, and also her bravery. At that time, she was determined that we're gonna survive no matter what. So as soon as they got to the jail, she started to scream at the guard. She told me the story later on, obviously I wasn't there, that she was arrested unlawfully because she was a war widow. And she started to show that paper she got from the Hungarian Ministry of Defense, as a proof that my father died, and everybody whose husband died during the war activities were entitled to the title war widow. The only thing was that Jewish widows were not entitled. Only non-Jewish soldiers' widows had some kind of privileges as war widows. Nevertheless, this guard went to the commandant of the jail, and he probably was ignorant enough, even not able to read what that paper was. He went to the commandant called my mother in. My mom could not tell me whether the commandant had pity on her or whether he didn't know what that paper was. Nevertheless, he let her go, and she walked out. She was the only one. The remaining people who were in the same jail the next day, they were taken to the railway station and were taken to Auschwitz.
And she, just as you said, the bravery and the chutzpah, she was able to get out. And then you described next was another act of chutzpah, is how you put it to me. When she got out, she knew you had to go somewhere else.
Yes. This time, people who were already in those designated houses were also forced, those who were not taken already to the concentration camps, to move into the Budapest ghetto. The Budapest ghetto was the old Jewish quarter of Budapest in the inner city. It's about 5 by 8 city blocks. There were 2 major synagogues and many very small synagogues scattered around that area. It was walled with brick walls and barbed wires. Jewish people could get in, but not out. It was guarded by the Hungarian police. So we were supposed to go there. However, by that time, Raoul Wallenberg, you mentioned in your introduction, came to Budapest. He was sent to Budapest by the American War Refugee Board, which was set up by President Roosevelt in 1944. The purpose was to save as many surviving Jews in Europe as possible. They were given money to use it whichever way they can to save Jewish lives. What Wallenberg did in Budapest, he bought up 32 apartment houses. These were relatively tall, 6, 8 stories high, and as many Jewish people, as many as he could move into these apartments, moved there, and they were protected by international law because the building belonged to the Swedish embassy, and under international law, no local authorities can enter in these buildings without the explicit permission of the Swedish embassy. So we went there and we stayed in one of the apartments. We didn't get the so-called Schutzpasses. Raoul Wallenberg also gave to many Jewish people. These were documents proving that the person was under the protection of the Swedish embassy. Raoul Wallenberg also did other brave acts, going to the Budapest railway station and the brickyard where the trains, actually these were cattle cars. You can see one of them in the museum on the 3rd floor. That's where Jewish people were taken, and 80 to 100 persons crowded into those cattle cars were taken to Auschwitz. Raoul Wallenberg went to the railway station and he threatened Nazi officers, telling them that the Soviet army will be here in no time. You're going to be captured, you're going to be tried. If you let the Jewish people go, I would vouch for you and you will be free. He gave them money and he saved the life of tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews.
Peter, you had described to me that it was late in the war, March 1944, when the Nazis came in, and they moved with staggering speed to deport the Jews of Hungary to the death camps. I believe in the span of 6 weeks, 450,000 Jews in Hungary were deported to death camps. And then in the summer of 1944, because of international pressure, the deportations stopped for a while. And you were living in one of the Wallenberg homes. By October 1944, they began again. Tell us what happened. Why did they begin again, and what did that mean for you and your mother?
1944, October 15, I believe, a far-right Nazi party took over the government in Hungary. And that's when all hell broke out in Budapest. The Nazis started to deport Jews first from the countryside, and that's when, in the span of 3 months, 400,000 plus Hungarian Jews were taken to various concentration camps, mostly Auschwitz-Birkenau. This was a tremendous logistic problem for the Nazis to transport so many people in such a short time. They couldn't do it all by themselves. Adolf Eichmann, who later on was captured and tried and hanged in Israel, he came to Budapest with 600 Sonderkommandos, and they were in charge of deporting so many people. Obviously, they couldn't do it without the active help of the Hungarian Nazis and the Hungarian police. October 1944, the Arrow Cross, that was the far-right Hungarian Nazi party, took over the government. They couldn't care about international law anymore. They went to these protected houses. They arrested the Jews. They took them from their apartments.
So international law didn't matter anymore?
At that time, it was no international law whatsoever. Some of the people were taken from the protected houses to railway stations and shipped to the concentration camps. Others were taken straight to the banks of the Danube River, which separates Buda and Pest. And those Wallenberg houses actually were 1 or 2 blocks away from the Danube, so it wasn't a long march for these people. They were taken to the Danube River. They had to disrobe, take off their clothes, shoes, and they were shot. Some of them were tied together, 3 or 4 persons. Only one was shot, and as he fell in the river, he pulled the other 2 or 3. And this was the winter of 1944, or late autumn, early winter. And those who didn't die instantly, they died because of the river.
So what happened to you and your mom in that situation?
We were, if I can use this word, lucky, whether it was divine providence or just sheer luck, when the Hungarian Nazi Arrow Cross thugs came to our apartment. One of the young Nazis, these were very young people because everybody else were already serving in the Hungarian army, recognized me. We were playing in the inner courtyard of the apartment building, and the Hungarian Nazis were there to guard the building. They just wanted to make sure nobody leaves those buildings. Anyway, this one guy took a liking of me, and he told to his friends that leave little Peter and his mom behind. I know them. Let's go to the next apartment. So we were lucky, we were left behind. The people in the next apartment were not so lucky, and we don't know what happened to them. After the Nazis left, we had to move again, and that was the time when we moved into the Budapest ghetto, where my grandparents and two of my aunts and my cousin already lived at this time.
And so when you moved into the Budapest ghetto, at that point, this is winter of 1944. The Russians are there essentially, and so you were there during the siege of Budapest. Tell us what the circumstances were like when you moved into the Budapest ghetto for you, what you were enduring. After all you'd been through, now you're in an unbelievable, unimaginable set of circumstances.
Yes, we lived with many lucky Jewish survivors who survived until October, November, December 1944 in the Budapest ghetto, because by that time Budapest was surrounded by the Soviet Red Army. Jews could not be transported to the concentration camps anymore, and our living, if you can call that living, was it's very hard to describe. Number one, there were air raids practically all day long. That time, navigation wasn't very sophisticated, so there were no nighttime raids, but the Allied forces and the Soviet Air Force bombed Budapest relentlessly, and we spent most of the daytime in the temporary bomb shelters. These were really not built as bomb shelters. They were the basement of the apartment buildings. When they built these apartments, they used the basement to store the fuel for the individual apartments. That time there was no central heating. Everybody had a little stall with wood or coal, depending on what kind of furnace they had in their apartment, dirt floor, and that's where we stayed all day long on a blanket on dirt floor. By that time, electricity was more or less non-existent. Water supply was cut off by the bombing. Food was I really don't know, and my mom never told me exactly how we survived, but I do remember one event when there was a gap between two bombing. People who were in the bomb shelter went out, and they went to the ruins of the houses which were bombed out by the Allied forces, and they went through these buildings rummaging for food, and whatever they could find, they brought back, and we ate it. Now, we, as I said, came from an Orthodox observant family, so we would not touch anything which was made out of pork. Fortunately, one day my grandmother found a big slab of bacon. Hungarian bacon is not the bacon like here. Most of them is just pure lard, and you have to eat it with bread. Of course, we didn't have bread. It was treif, as we say. It was not kosher, and nevertheless we ate it because every calorie you could take in meant one more day to live and one more chance to survive.
And you stayed there for weeks until your liberation in mid-January 1945. Tell us what you remember and what you know of your liberation after this unbelievable ordeal that you've just been through.
The Soviet Red Army entered the Budapest ghetto on January 17, 1945, and that was the day when we were liberated. You use the word liberation, and I am using it because it's part of the Holocaust history, and rewriting the Holocaust history, unfortunately, that some of the current day historians don't use the word liberation. They use the term one occupation, the German occupation, was replaced by another occupation by the Soviet Red Army. Occupation it was, but it was freedom for us, Jews definitely. We were able to come out from the temporary bomb shelters. My mom and I walked back to our apartment. I remember the stench of the dead bodies on the street. I remember the carcasses of dead horses. That time, horse-drawn wagons did most of the delivery of whatever had to be delivered. And we went back to an apartment. We were one of the few lucky ones whose apartment was occupied by an ethnic German family. When my mom and I left the apartment, we had to leave everything behind. Everything, because my mom could carry one little suitcase or whatever she had. And there wasn't much she could put in that suitcase. We went back to an apartment, and we found the apartment practically intact. Everything was there, including these diaries.
The diaries were still
well,
there? Wow.
And
that's how
the
you
postcards, it was in one of the drawers.
They hadn't touched any of that.
They did not touch anything. Not only that, but they voluntarily give up the apartment to us. They were happy to see us, that we were alive. Unfortunately, some of the apartments which were occupied by people who were less generous, they didn't return the apartment. They didn't return the belongings of the Jewish people. Right. And again, this is a sad part of the Holocaust history also in Hungary.
So you've moved back into your apartment. You're fortunate to be able to do that. What did your mom do now? What at that point, what did she do to do the basics, feed you? What did she do from that point?
Well, the first thing was to get food, obviously, and food was short supply, very, very short supply. So what people did and what my mom did, that she took whatever she could preserve valuable, some jewelry, family jewelry, and she went to the countryside and she bartered the jewelry for food. She came back, so we had at least something to eat. Obviously, hat making wasn't a good business after the war, so inflation was incredible that time. So my mom was, again, very good with her hands. She started to repair clothes for other people, for family members, and whatever income she could gather, that's what she did, until she joined to a co-op which was set up by the government to make women clothes. And she was a seamstress from there on until she retired.
Peter, you mentioned that when you were in the Budapest ghetto, your grandparents were there. What happened to your grandparents, and did other members of your extended family survive?
Out of my mother's 8 siblings, 2 survived because they were lucky enough to come to the United States before the war. My mom and 2 of her sisters survived. Other family members died in various circumstances. Some were arrested and taken to concentration camps. Actually, my father's two brothers was taken to forced labor camp, and they died during the war activities there. My maternal grandparents survived, but only survived a couple of months of the Holocaust. It happened to them what happened to many Jewish people who by the time they were liberated, either at the concentration camps or in Budapest or whatever city they lived in, their body was so weak that even if food was available again, they could not cope with a common cold, and usually whatever illness was, there were medication to cure them. Their body wasn't able to resist, and they just died under natural circumstances, if you call starving and being deprived of medical attention normal circumstances.
And your mother, who just the little glimpse that we've had today, she was clearly a remarkable woman. She was resourceful, she was brave, she took great risks to save you and herself. After the war, what was it like for her? After all she'd been through, survives the war, now you're living under a communist regime in Hungary, she wants to get out. How did she do after the war?
Well, very briefly, after my mom gave up all the hope that my father would return one day from the Soviet gulags, she remarried in 1953. My stepfather was a Holocaust survivor. Actually, he survived Auschwitz. He was liberated in Auschwitz. He came back from Auschwitz. His regular weight was around 150, 160 pounds. When he came back, he was 90, 95 pounds only. Our life in Hungary under communist system, you can read about it in memoirs and museum websites. We don't have time to divulge in. It wasn't easy. One oppression was replaced by another. Our life as Jews were not in danger. However, ironically, I couldn't practice my Jewish religion because religion was against the communist ideology. I grew up without Jewish education. I returned to Judaism after I came to the United States and started to practice the religion of my parents and grandparents.
Peter,
go ahead.
I want to be able to turn to our audience for just a couple of questions. So before we do that, just a couple more questions for you. Incredibly, when you went back, the diary, your mom's diary, the postcards were still there. You shared with me that your father, when he would write those postcards, he would refer to your mom as little squirrel, right?
Yeah, that's a Hungarian term of endearment, and it's very special. And every time I hear that word, I just remember that that's how my mother was called by my father.
It must be incredibly precious to you to have those postcards and that diary still to this day. The other thing I wanted to mention, if I remember this correctly, that you described going back to your home and it was intact and everything was there. Even today, all these years later, after you were able to defect from Hungary, come to the United States, your mom was able to move here after you got here, and I came to visit, right?
Correct, visit only.
And then passed away while she was here. Your house is still the same, pretty much. I think you shared that with me.
Yes, the house is intact. It's still there.
Same
and,
furnishings?
Same apartment. And I had the opportunity and the privilege to go back with my family, with all of my girls, and were able to show them the apartment I grew up in. And it's a very precious memory for me.
Peter, I wish we could talk about all that happened after the war, what you went through in Hungary to get your education, which was not easy, and then making the decision and why you made the decision to come here. There'll be a chance afterwards for you to come up on stage and talk to Peter, and you may want to ask him some things about that. Let's turn now, Peter, if you're okay, just for a couple of questions from our audience before we end. I think we have microphones. So we have 2 microphones on the stand. So if you have a question, we ask that you go to the microphone and ask your question. Make it as brief as you can. If you don't have a question now, you'll have the chance to ask Peter one afterwards. So if there's no brave souls that want to jump up to the microphone, we understand that. So we'll have an opportunity for you to do so afterwards. So I'm gonna assume that. Are you ready to go ask a question? Here comes a brave soul. Okay. And after you ask your question, I may repeat it just to make sure Peter and I and everybody in the room hears it, if that's okay. Okay.
Hi, I just wanted to say first, thank you for sharing your story. It was really amazing. The question that I had, it relates more to the beginning of what you were talking about. You mentioned that you moved in with a Christian family and a few days later, neighbors had denounced you. Do you feel that the sentiment of those people, was it out of malice or more out of fear?
I think the question was when you and your mother were denounced, was it done out of malice or was there denouncing you out of fear? Do you know?
Well, we don't know because we don't know who the actual person was. You can assume malice because the person who denounced us, he had no obligation. Well, actually, under the law, one had the obligation to report any hiding Jew. However, if somebody had some kind of moral laws to follow and knowing that law was unlawful to begin with, then he or she shouldn't have reported us. So we really don't know. What we do know, in one hand, that anti-Semitism has been strong in Hungary throughout history, still alive and still well. We also know that there were very brave people who hid Jewish people. Actually, in Yad Vashem, Jerusalem Holocaust Museum, there is the wall of righteous Gentiles who saved Jewish people, and 1,800 Hungarian names are etched in that marble or granite wall. So, in one hand, there were people who risked their life, individuals, and on the other hand, there were bystanders who did absolutely nothing. In the best case, or in worst case, they reported on hiding Jews.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for the question. I'm going to turn back to Peter in just a moment to close our program. I want to thank all of you for being here. Remind you that we'll have first-person programs each Wednesday and Thursday until the middle of August. So we hope you can return and join us for that program. And also, we'll be live streaming tomorrow's program and all of our programs in April. So you'll be able to tune in and listen to those on the YouTube channel of the station, of the museum, if you would like to do that. 2 things before I turn back to Peter. One is when Peter is finished, our photographer, Joel, is going to come up on the stage and take a picture of Peter with you as the background. So we want you to stay for that. If you would do that for us, that would be great. And then as I mentioned before, when Peter's done, he will remain on stage, and we invite you to come up on stage and shake his hand, get a picture taken with him, or ask him the question that you may be thinking about right now. So we welcome that very much. It's our tradition at first person that our first person has the last word. And so with that, I'd like to turn to Peter to close our program.
Very briefly, somebody once said that the Holocaust is a unique moment in history. However, the consequences of the Holocaust is very universal, meaning that what happened to Jewish people between 1933 and 1945 in the Nazi-occupied Europe is unique to the 6 million who perished during the Holocaust and the survivors. However, the consequences, learning what happened prior to the Nazi takeover, how propaganda and fake news and discrimination helped the Nazis to take over the government and to discriminate against, not just against the Jews, but they were discriminating against Romas and homosexuals. We learn these signs and we should apply in our everyday life. The motto of the museum is never again. What you do matters. And never again we understand that we don't want genocide happen again. Unfortunately, after World War II ended, we had genocide in Uganda, in Kosovo, in Cambodia. So obviously we haven't learned the lesson. The second part, what you do matters. The U is in different color if you see our brochures and the signs on the wall. The U is extremely important because every one of us in this room watching on the internet should not only learn what happened during the Holocaust, but also to apply it in our everyday life. And we have to stand up against discrimination, against bullying, against any action against people who look different, who have different religion, whose skin color is different. So I hope that's the message. If you don't remember anything else, that's what you take home, because our numbers, survivors, eyewitnesses are dwindling. I am the youngest at age 77 in our group, and you are the one who have to take over and keep the memory of the 6 million Jews alive.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.